Sitting next to an empty chair and you know it's empty, raise your hand. And we have a few empty seats for some lovely people. So come on over, find a hand and sit next to the hand. Good, welcome tonight. This is VBS College of Jewish Studies, and we're delighted to welcome you. College of Jewish Studies offers university-level Jewish learning without sororities, quizzes, football teams, or pep rallies. And we're certainly delighted to have you. If you're a member of Valley Beth Shalom, welcome. It's good to see you. If you're a member of another congregation, we're delighted you've come to worship and to celebrate with us. If you're not a member of a shul, we would love to have you here. Please find one of us after the talk, and we'll sign you up, and you too can feel like all this is yours. A few announcements of things going on here at VBS so that you can all come back and feel at home every night. Tonight, Wednesday night, College of Jewish Studies. Next week, no class, because it's Erev Yontif, okay? It's Erev Yontif, and I want you to know that we are a conservative synagogue, and we celebrate 2 days Yontif. So for us, Thursday and Friday are both holy days. Thursday, we will be gathering with families around large tables laden with turkey. Friday, we will do what all Americans do. We're going to the mall. So please celebrate a lovely holiday. We will return. College of Jewish Studies returns on Wednesday evening, December the 6th. And we will begin our conversations about the rabbinic tradition. And our guests that night, if I have it down here, right? November 29th. I got it wrong. There's another one first. November 29th is the next one. November 29th, we'll begin our conversation about the rabbinic tradition. What is the Talmud, the Midrash, the Mishnah, all of those sacred books. And we'll have an overview of those wonderful books. And then the following week, December the 6th, we'll welcome Professor Christine Hayes, who's Professor of Jewish Studies at Yale University, for a conversation about how the rabbis understood, how the rabbis saw the world through the eyes of the Talmud. So please join us for those 2 nights. A couple of other nights coming up. Friday night, this coming Friday night, in this very room, one of our musical services. This one's called Tamarim. Tamarim is a musical service. It's offered in the tradition of the Sephardic community. Beautiful Sephardic music led by our artist in residence, Asher Levy. We begin at 6 o'clock with what we Ashkenazim called a nash and what Sephardim called a mezeh. Mezeh is a beautiful Sephardic word for a nash. So you can come hungry. It'll keep you full through the meal, through the service. It's a beautiful musical service, deeply uplifting, wonderful touching. So please come Friday night. We'll be done by around 7:30, and after the mezeh, you can go home and have a very light dinner. And then on Shabbos morning, of course, we gather for Torah study and celebration of Shabbat. 2 or 3 other quick events. On November the 27th, which is the Monday night after Thanksgiving. So you have Thanksgiving, you have Black Friday, you have Shabbos, you have, oh my God, I can't believe I bought all that stuff in the mall Sunday. On that Monday night, we're going to continue in our series of political programs. And on that Monday night, the 27th, we're going to sit down together with 3 of the founders of the National Republican Jewish Coalition. 3 of the gentlemen who put together this coalition of Jews who see the world through the eyes of conservative politics. The official name of the program is American Conservatism, the Republican Party in the Age of Trump. I wanted to call it the Elephants in the Room, but they thought that was too kitschy. But the basic idea is we'd like to talk to people of the right, of the Republican Party, and of conservative politics about how they see the current state of the world, how they see the current condition of the Republican Party, how they see the Trump presidency, and where America is and where America is going. It's a very important conversation with 3 very, very thoughtful fellows. So please come and join us. That's the 27th. That's Monday night, the 27th at 7:30. It's free, and if you come, you're the first 500 people, you get free brownies, okay? And then on the Thursday of that week, we join together with our friends of American Peace Now for a conversation with Amir Tivon, who is the Washington correspondent for Haaretz newspaper, a wonderful analyst of Israeli and American politics. And lastly, please put down on your calendar the Friday night and Shabbat of December 15th and 16th. It's the 3rd yahrzeit of our Rabbi Schulweis, and we will be celebrating his life and his career with a scholar in residence for the weekend. And our scholar is Rabbi Yitz and Blue Greenberg. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg is, I would say, the best, most important living Jewish philosopher in the world. And he has given up travel, but he's coming here very specially to remember and to help us remember Rabbi Schulweis. He'll be speaking about his new philosophical work called The Triumph of Life. And Blue Greenberg will be with us as well to talk about her work in Orthodox feminism. Friday night, there'll be a dinner and a dessert. If you want to come for dinner, you want to come for dessert and learn with Yitz. Shabbos morning, you can learn with Yitz in the Torah study, or you can come to the Neshama Minyan and learn with Blue, and then we'll learn together at a Shabbat Shiur. And Saturday night, we'll gather for a Malava Malka, for a gathering to celebrate the end of Shabbat and continue our learning with Rabbi Greenberg and with Mrs. Greenberg. So please put that down. It's the 15th and 16th. So Friday night is Tumarim. Then comes the holiday. Monday night, the 27th, the Republicans, American conservatives, and Trump. Thursday night, Amir Tivon from Haaretz. And then on the 14th and 15th and 16th, Rabbi Greenberg and Mrs. Greenberg, a wonderful opportunity to grow as a Jew. Please, if you would, rise from your seats, turn to the folks beside you, wish them good evening and welcome.
Good evening and welcome. Jason Will.
Oh, where are they?
I don't know, they wouldn't let me find them a special seat.
Well, I'll find them, yeah. Good. Now that you've made friends, put your arms around those people and draw them close. We give thanks for the opportunity to learn Torah together. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu mitzvotav etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Please be seated. When we study history, it is all too easy to make that history abstract and to forget that history is the story of human beings, of people who struggle with the issues of life, of society, of God, of meaning, of purpose. And so what we wanted to do in the course of our survey of Jewish history this year is to focus not only on the books and the trends and the overall arching ideas of history, but to focus on discrete personalities. Who were the individuals, the people who made this history and about whom this history is told? Who were the people whose decisions shaped the ages that we're learning? The individual we're going to take up tonight is unique, and I can prove it to you because tomorrow morning, right here, you can come back and watch. Little groups of 3-year-olds are going to sit in the nursery school. They're going to sit in circles, and they're going to sing, David, Melech Yisrael, Chai, Chai, V'kayam. David, Melech Yisrael. David, Melech Yisrael. David, King of Israel, Chai V'kayam, is alive and well. Now, anyone who's been dead for 3,200 years, but the whole Jewish world still thinks they're alive and well, that is a unique and compelling personality. And if you want to really learn this personality, to really think deeply about this personality, there's a beautiful book that came out 2 years ago. There's a series of wonderful books called Jewish Lives. And in that series, Rabbi Wolpe wrote the biography of King David. It is a beautiful book. It is a moving book. And is a deeply thoughtful meditation on the character of this historical and literary personality. And it is our privilege to welcome Rabbi Wolpe tonight. Rabbi Wolpe, as all of you know, is the senior rabbi of Sinai Temple, a small, warm shtibel just across the hill. And he's slept all the way across the hill. Between him and there are about 3 million Jews trying to get to Valley Beth Shalom. And we're delighted that he fought his way. Rabbi Wolpe is a dear friend. We've been together for many, many, many years. And you all know Rabbi Wolpe because his writing is all over the place. It's in the Jewish Journal. It's on the Time Magazine website. It's on the Huffington Post website. And it's many other places. But the thing that you need to know as well is the following, is that Rabbi Wolpe brings to his rabbinate a very, very special quality of thoughtfulness, a very special quality of reflection. Maimonides taught us that truth is available in all places, and the seeker of truth is the seeker of God. And what Rabbi Wolpe is so beautifully adept at doing is finding truth in many different places, in literature, in philosophy, in politics, and tying it together with the truths of Torah in a way that is truly beautiful and truly unique. Please welcome my dear friend and teacher, Rabbi David Wolpe. So glad you're here. Thank you. You have to speak right into the mic or they'll yell.
That was so nice that I hate to start the way I'm about to start, which is, as long as I've known Rabbi Feinstein, and as dear a friend as he in fact is, I hate to say that he's also a failure. He is. He's a failure. I can prove it. We both spoke to the GA, to the General Assembly. A couple of days before, we were emailing each other, what are you going to talk about? What are you going to talk about? And he said, I'm going to challenge them so much that I'm going to ensure they'll never invite me back. And he failed. Because he did challenge them, but he did it so brilliantly that I promise you they're going to invite him back, which is just one more example of how badly people estimate their own capacities. But actually, it is in some ways a very good introduction to David, for reasons that will become clear in a moment. But first I want to start with the same joke that I started with the GA, because, you know, rabbis have to recycle jokes as often as possible, just like comedians used to do before they told them once on Johnny Carson, and then they were done. So before this hits YouTube, a rabbi and a doctor are talking. And the doctor says to the rabbi, you know, Rabbi, I don't mean to brag, but sometimes when I have poor patients, I treat them for free. The rabbi thinks for a minute, he goes, I do that. The doctor says, well, when I write prescriptions for them, if I know they can't afford the prescription, I will subvent it so they don't have to pay anything over the market price and they can get their medicine essentially for free. The rabbi thinks for a minute, he goes, I do that. And now the doctor's getting frustrated. He says, when I do surgery, I make sure that the hospital won't charge anything over the insurance so that they don't have to pay anything out of pocket if they're poor, and really, in essence, they get the surgery for nothing. The rabbi thinks for a minute, he goes, I do that. The doctor says, look, Rabbi, all due respect, you don't have patients, you don't write prescriptions, and you certainly don't do surgery. And the rabbi says, oh, no, I mean, I say nice things about myself too. So I'm about to talk about King David. And you might think, obviously, I'm saying nice things about myself, because it's impossible to write a book about someone who has your name and not realize that you're writing, David did this, David said that, David was like this, especially because I begin the book by talking about my father naming me David, and his uncle David was the person who took care of him after his father died when he was very young. And so there is this identification. So I would like to disclaim right now as you'll hear, any real resemblance to the character I'm about to talk about, because if you don't know the story of David, it may shock you how checkered is the story of David, how difficult, how problematic, in many different ways, not just in one way. So let me start by telling you that we have 3 different introductions to this guy. And none of them make sense chronologically. It's almost like different snapshots of different moments in David's life. So the first one we have is Samuel going off to the house of Jesse the Bethlehemite to anoint the new king. And God tells Samuel to go. And by the way, just as an aside, he also tells Samuel to lie. That is, God instructs Samuel, who's the high priest, to tell a lie. Because Samuel says, if I go off to the house of David and Saul, who's the king, hears about it, he's going to kill me. So God says, tell him you went to sacrifice. Which he does. I mean, he does sacrifice, but really it's a lie. Nonetheless, Samuel goes off to the house of Jesse, and he says to him, basically, present your kids. So Jesse brings out his firstborn son, whose name is Eliab. He's a tall, handsome, strapping figure of a man. Samuel gets up to anoint him, and God says, pay no attention to his appearance or to his stature. I've rejected him. Because I don't see people the way you do. Ki adam yireh la'einayim. People see what's visible. Va'adonai yireh la'levav. But God sees into the heart. So Samuel says, next please. And he goes to all 7 sons. And if you know mythology, 7 is the perfect number. Right? In Irish mythology, the world is going to be saved by the 7th son of a 7th son. So 7's the perfect number. And when he's done, when Jesse is done, Samuel says, are you sure you don't have any more kids? She goes, oh, well, there's the little one out back who's pasturing the sheep. And he says, go and get him. David walks in. He's young and ruddy-cheeked. And God says, rise and anoint him. This is the one. So what's the first thing we know about David? In his own home, his own father forgets about him. I mean, this is like the President of the United States comes to your house and you introduce him to all the kids, but you forget that you have another kid who's up in his room. It's inconceivable. But that's what happens. And the second story about him is also in its way a story of disregard, which is his brothers are out fighting the Philistines. And David is sent to bring them food. That's why he goes, which reminds you, if you have this sort of biblical ping-pong effect in your mind, of the story of Joseph. That's how Joseph gets sold into slavery. His father says to him, go out and give your brother some food. So David does the same thing. He gets to his brothers. His brothers are in a situation where, as you know, this Philistine giant named Goliath has said to the Israelites, you know what, let's not kill each other. Let's not have one of these wholesale slaughters. You pick someone to fight me. We'll fight. Whoever wins, the other people will be enslaved to them. By the way, when Goliath dies, I hate to ruin the end of the story, but yeah, Goliath dies, the Philistines renege on the bargain, right? They don't agree to be slaves to the Israelites, but let's leave that aside. No one wants to fight Goliath. Now, this already lets you know no one means not even the king. So Saul also doesn't want to fight Goliath. David comes, and he hears talk of this. Now, traditionally in the Bible and in mythology, scholars will tell you that the first thing someone says is defining of who they are. Okay? What's the first thing that David says? The first words out of his mouth. He was anointed before, but we didn't hear him say anything. Here's the first thing David says. What will be given to the man who defeats Goliath? Yep. Then he says, because he has violated the God of Israel and he's transgressed and he's this and that. But the first thing he says is, if I win, what do I get? Right? So he goes up to face Goliath. At first, by the way, Saul tries to put his armor on him. It's too big. It's too cumbersome. He takes it off, which is very symbolic. He goes to face Goliath. And we think, of course, and the way the story is set up is it's little David, big Goliath. But the truth is that David has an advantage because David has a long-range weapon. Goliath doesn't. He has a spear, which he apparently doesn't throw. He just jabs, but he's so tall and his reach is so broad that he can defeat anyone. But David has, and remember that shepherds used to have slings and stones all the time. That's how they knew how many sheep they had, because they had 10 stones in their sling, 12, 14, less, more. This, by the way, has a beautiful relation to Jewish graves. When on a grave it says, Tiyeh nishmoto tzror b'tzror hachayim. Tzror in Hebrew also means a pebble. So we usually translate it as may his soul be bound up in the bonds of eternal life, but there's a very beautiful interpretation that you're asking God as a shepherd to keep the soul of this person the way you have in a sling, which is what David's got. Now, of course, modern Israeli sociologists have studied shepherds and how fast they can and accurately they can sling a stone. And guess what? They can do it very well. Because if that's all you do all day long when you're out pasturing the sheep, and there isn't a lot to do for most of human history, you don't have a Kindle, right? You don't have an iPhone. So what do? You aim at stuff and you use your sling. But nobody thinks of this except David. David always enlarges the picture. He always sees possibilities that others don't. So he goes up against Goliath, and Goliath says to him, "Why are you coming at me with sticks?" Which probably means that David had his staff in his hand, fooling Goliath into thinking, "I'm going to try to beat you with my stick," which is ridiculous, but would allow Goliath to draw close enough for David to get good aim. He kills him, probably, by the way, not with the stone. He probably knocks him out with the stone and then cuts his head off. Right? This is the ancient world. This is not for the squeamish, right? He cuts his head off, and then David becomes an instant hero. Well, who doesn't like heroes? The king doesn't like heroes, right? You don't want someone to be more popular than you are. Leaders don't like that. I didn't say any particular leader. I'm just talking leaders, in general. Leaders in general don't like that. So what makes this strange is that the third introduction of David is that he is summoned to Saul's house because Saul, I want to be careful about this. It's thousands of years ago, right? And I remember once reading a biographical author who said, next time you read a biography, just imagine how well your best friend would describe your love life. And when you realize that not even your best friend could get your love life right, realize that this biographer who never met the subject and is going on document probably got a lot of stuff wrong, right? And doesn't know his subject nearly as well as he thinks. So this is thousands of years ago. I never met Saul. We have very little to go on. I'm not a psychiatrist, but he was manic depressive. I'm just saying, right? At least the way the text describes him, and after all, we're talking here about the biography of a text, not a person, because the text is what we have. Saul does have these moments of mania, and he has these moments of deep depression. That's clear from the text. And when he's depressed, his handlers, so to speak, recruit David to come and play music to coax Saul out of his depression. So already, even though obviously these three things don't go together very well, but they do describe characteristics that are remarkable. Here's a warrior, and he's also emotionally sensitive and gifted enough to coax the king out of depression, and yet he is unobtrusive enough in certain ways to be forgotten by his own father, and he's a younger brother. In fact, he's such a younger brother that when he goes to defeat Goliath, you have this great exchange of him with Eliab. Remember the tall, handsome, strapping one that got rejected? Eliab says to him, "What are you doing here?" And he says, "Hey, I wasn't doing anything wrong," in the manner of little brothers for all time, right? So he clearly has that self-identification. But here's what makes him remarkable. There are two things, essentially, that in this phase of David's story make him remarkable. One is he is preternaturally gifted with the talent of ingratiating himself with other people. The name David means beloved, and he is beloved over and over and over. He's by far the most loved person in the Torah, in the Tanakh, in the whole Bible. Because he comes into Saul's house, and soon enough, first of all, Saul, who will end up trying to kill him, is said to love him. There's no way he could ever take the kingship over from Saul, because Saul has a firstborn son named Jonathan, who's supposed to take the kingship. And there are only two ways for David to get the kingship from Jonathan. Either he has to kill Jonathan, which he can't really do, because if he did that, all of Israel would rise up against him. Or he has to have Jonathan voluntarily give him the kingship. Why would Jonathan do that? Because Jonathan falls in love with him, which he does. Whether this is homosexual love or not, I'll come back to in a second. But for the moment, just whether it is or not, the point is Jonathan falls in love with him. And then so does Saul's daughter, Michal. Now, there are two ways of seeing this, as you will see several times in the course of David's life. Either David just happens to be a lovable guy, or he's very smart, and he knows exactly what he's doing, and he goes into Saul's house and systematically, emotionally conquers every key person that stands in the way of his ambition. I don't know. I can't know, but you can guess one way or the other. However, that's what happens. Saul becomes jealous of him, tries to kill him. Michal saves him. Saul gets angry at his own daughter for saving him, and David runs away. And he has this pact with Jonathan where Jonathan also helps to save him. So David already is beloved of God, beloved of Saul, beloved of Michal, beloved of Jonathan, and even the people of Israel are said to love David. It never says the people of Israel loved Moses. But they love David. David is a different kind of personality. David has this remarkable charisma that draws people's love. And once he runs away and Jonathan realizes that his father wants to kill him, so they together plot for David to be in a safe place. David runs away. Now let me just say a word about Saul and Jonathan, because David and Jonathan. Everybody asks, was it gay? Was it homosexual? Was it not? The honest answer is we can't know. The evidence on one side is that David says, "Your love was dearer to me than the love of women." That Saul says to Jonathan, "To the shame of your mother's nakedness, you help this guy," right? In other words, sexual metaphors. But I got to tell you also that male love, for most of human history, used sexual metaphors without necessarily being homosexual, right? Lincoln slept in the same bed as his best friend for years, and no one thought to say, "Aha, you slept in the same bed." Clearly, right? It was a different world. So who knows? The one thing against it, the most powerful argument against it, was if it was seen to be homosexual, given how strong the Bible strictures seem to be against it, why wouldn't they have muddled the story a little bit? But I don't have a strong preference in this. It could have been, it could have not been. It could be that category didn't exist the same way as it does in modern society. Whatever you want to decide is okay with me. David is saved. Oh, thank you. David is saved. Your timing is unbelievable. Unbelievable. And now I want to say the second feature of David that makes him unique, in addition to his charisma and his ability to draw people's love, which is that David does something that is virtually unique among biblical men, and maybe among modern men, he listens to women. He really does. Which is not at all what you would think of this David warrior, so on. And when I say that he listens to women, I don't only mean that Michal tells him, do this and I'll save your life. Abigail, right? I don't have to tell you the whole story, just trust me on this. Abigail, who is the first and only, I think only woman in the Bible who is called intelligent before she is called beautiful. Interesting. She gives the longest single speech that I know of in the Torah, in the Tanakh, in the Bible, and David listens to the whole speech, does not interrupt once, and changes his behavior based on what she says. Not only that, but later on, since I'm on the women theme, I'm going to jump chronologically. It's very hard to tell the story of David in perfect chronology and get all these themes in. Later on, when David is estranged from his son Avshalom, for reasons I'm not going to go into, but we can discuss if you want. When he's estranged from his son, a woman named the wise woman of Tekoa, in other words, a nobody, a lady off the street, comes in to see him, tells him this long parable about the estrangement of her son. David listens to the whole thing, gives her advice, and then realizes that she's really talking about his son and was sent by his general Yoav. Now, this is extraordinary, and it tells you that, and this is true just here, look, for having come out this evening, you deserve one great truth. So here's one great truth, seriously. Nobody, I mean nobody, is one thing. Nobody. And therefore, when you see people who have done terrible things, and then other people say, but he was so nice, he was so kind, he stood up for me, and you go, idiot. It's not true. People are complicated. David did some terrible things, but that doesn't mean that he didn't have some remarkable qualities. He did. And one of them was the fact that he was a receptive soul. He could listen to people, and he could take in their message, and he could change because of it. And also David had, and now I want to get to the other part of David's life, he had, as all great leaders do, he had a nose for power. That was really extraordinary. Because not only does he go to Saul's house and then he essentially takes over, right, without a shot being fired, but then he runs away to the Philistines. And he ingratiates himself with the Philistine king. At first, by the way, he plays mad, which is one of many Shakespearean echoes in the David story, or Davidian echoes in the Shakespeare canon, to put it chronologically, right? He plays mad just like Hamlet does. And the king says, why are you bringing me this slobbering idiot, right? Because David was afraid he would kill him as a fleeing Israelite. But then later, the king starts to trust him, even though the generals don't. And so David is constantly playing this game in between two different power bases, because Saul is running after him in Israel, and the Philistine generals don't like him in what we now think of as Gaza, right? The Gaza Strip, that's where the Philistines live. And David has to maneuver between them. But he not only succeeds in doing it, but here's something else that happens, I don't know, 6, 7 times in David's story. David has enemies all along the way, okay? And I'm going to give you the most important example in a moment. But every single time, this is what happens. So, for example, Saul's descendants are enemies of David. After Saul and Jonathan die and David becomes king, Saul has a kid. And this kid tries to take over, Ishbosheth. And strangely enough, people kill Ishbosheth and come to David and say, we have killed your enemy. And you know what David says? How dare you lift your hand against the son of Saul? How dare you kill them? And his people kill the people who killed his enemy. Now, this happens really several times with David's enemies. And there are, again, two ways of seeing this. There is, what a wonderful guy. Because not only does he object to the idea that his enemy, who is after all an Israelite, would be killed, but he takes steps against the people who would dare to do that. The other way of seeing it is, wow, what a clever guy. Not only has he managed to get his enemy killed, but he just killed the only people that could attest to the fact that he was behind it. Right? And in our cynical age, I know we favor number two. That doesn't make it right. It just means that that's our general, is obviously if David's enemies get killed one after another, and they do. It's astonishing. After another. It's the same thing, by the way, happens with Saul. Saul is the first one that this happens to. Saul is losing the battle, tries to kill himself, does not succeed, has someone kill him, and then they come to David, assuming that David will be proud and pleased because now he's king. He says, how dare you lift your hand against Saul, the anointed of Israel? Kill him. And they kill him. So does that mean that David was behind it in some way? We don't know. All we know is that David gets the kingship. But, as you know, as soon as you get what you want, troubles start. So I have 2 more episodes to tell you about, then I'm going to wrap it up and we'll have time for questions. Here's the beginning in 2 Samuel. And by the way, the David story is in the book of Samuel, okay? And the reason it's called Samuel is because Samuel's the first main character in the book. And the reason it's 1st and 2nd Samuel is just because it's a long story and scrolls are unwieldy. So they've divided it up into 2. That's that simple, okay? If it had been in the age of a book, they would have just called it Samuel. In 2 Samuel, here's what happened. It says, it was spring, the time when kings go to war. And David was strolling on the roof of the palace. Now, first of all, let me just tell you why spring is the time that kings go to war. Because the ground is hard, which means your horses will not get caught in the mud. And there's fruit on the trees, which means that your troops will be fed, well fed. But notice the phrasing, because the author is really an author of genius. I don't think there's any question about that. Instead of saying David shouldn't have been at the palace, what he says is, it's the time when kings go to war, David's in the palace. Now, Israel is at war. They're fighting. They're fighting with the Philistines. David, though, isn't there. Instead, now that he has the kingship, he's strolling around the palace. And you sort of feel like, fat and happy. It doesn't say that, but that's sort of the implication that arises from the text. And he looks out and he sees a naked Bathsheba bathing. Now, this is a Rorschach test. Do you think Bathsheba is there to entice David, or do you think that David is a predator? It was a rhetorical question. You can decide, although I have my own views, and maybe my views will become clear in a moment. So the Bible says, Bathsheba, who is the wife of so-and-so and the daughter of so-and-so. In other words, she's taken. It names her husband and her father. So there is no ambiguity about it. But David summons her to the palace, and she comes. Now, I think that here you have to hear the power imbalance. When the king summons you to the palace, you go. And if you ever see Rembrandt's portrait of Bathsheba, you see her holding the note with a sad look on her face, because she knows this can't end well. And she's right. She comes to the palace. They sleep together. Bathsheba, so far we don't have a word from her. The first thing she says is, I'm pregnant. Now the king has a problem. So how does he try to address it? Bathsheba is married to Uriah the Hittite. In other words, her husband is not an Israelite. Just like there are tribes that fought in ancient times with the Israelites. Think of like the Druze in Israel today, okay? That's a sort of good analogy. That is, people who live in Israelite territory who are loyal to the Israelite state but are not Israelites. So Uriah the Hittite comes, David summons him back from the war. He comes to the king, and David says, so how's the battle going? You know. And then he says, listen, rest, relax, go home, sleep with your wife. Now, you got to figure, if David could see her from his roof, she couldn't have been that far away. So when he says to Uriah, go sleep with your wife, he's not talking about, like, go from Sinai to VBS, right? He's saying, you know, go from here to across the street, basically. Uriah says, how could I possibly sleep with my wife when your master's troops are fighting in the field? In other words, the Hittite, who's not an Israelite, is far more noble than the Israelite king. So what does David do? He gets him drunk. Remember, this is David. He's resourceful. He gets him drunk. And then he says to him again, now go sleep with your wife. And he still won't do it. And he sleeps on the foot of the palace because he won't go home. Now David has no other recourse, at least in his own eyes, and he commits the most cynical act of brutality, and not the most brutal, because the Bible's got a lot of brutality, but the most cynical act of brutality. He writes a letter saying, put this guy on the front lines and make sure he gets killed. Seals it with the king's seal, gives it to Uriah, and says, go and give this to Yoav, who is the commander of his troops. So he sends Uriah off with his own suicide note. And Uriah goes dutifully off with his note, and a couple of scholars have asked the question, did he know? Which gives it sort of an extra pathos if he did. I mean, maybe he knew he was caught in a trap he couldn't get out of. I don't know. But he goes off, he gives it to Yoav, Yoav puts him in front, he gets killed. So, David finds out. The threat is now gone, presumably. And Natan, who is a prophet, comes to David. And he says to him, there was a rich man and a poor man. The rich man had flocks and herds and everything. The poor man had one lamb that he cherished. A guest came to the rich man's house. He went and took the poor man's lamb and slaughtered it and served it to dinner. What should be done with such a man? And David says, such a man deserves to die. At which point, Natan says to him, you are the man. And here is where David redeems himself. Not by what he does, but by what he doesn't do. What he doesn't do is say, cut off that prophet's head. Because in the ancient world, kings, I quote in the book that the Cambyses, who was the son of Cyrus, wanted to marry his sister, ancient Persian king, right? A few hundred years after David. He wants to marry his sister, and he asked the wise men of the kingdom, Herodotus tells this story, go and find a law that says I can marry my sister. And they go and they look and they look and they look and they come back to the king and they said, I'm sorry, there is no law that says you can marry your sister, but we did find a law that says the king can do whatever he wants. And that was the way of the ancient world, but David doesn't do that. Because there is something in David throughout the entire story that actually acknowledges that God is sovereign over him. So when he is caught, what he does is, instead of saying Natan deserves to die, he fasts, he rips his clothes, he mourns, he weeps. God tells him that his child will die as a result of this transgression, and David cries and cries, the child dies, and then David arises from his weeping. And when his court says, why are you no longer weeping? He says, well, the child will never come to me, but I will go to him. So again, one of the things that makes reading David's story and writing about David's story so remarkable is as soon as you think you've got him pegged, he's much deeper than you ever imagined. Now, as I said, I was going to tell two stories. I'm just going to wrap up with the second one. The first half of the book of David is really about his running from Saul. That is, he runs from his surrogate father. In the second half of the book, it's about running from Avshalom. His son rebels against him. So he runs first from his father and then from his son. And what happens in the second half of the book is he says to Yoav, whom I mentioned before, but briefly, Yoav is the commander of his troops. He says to Yoav, basically, put this rebellion down, but don't hurt Avshalom. Do not hurt, he says, a hair on his head. And Avshalom was famous for having, he was vain, and he had long and flowing hair. And sure enough, the hair gets caught in a tree, and that's how Avshalom gets caught. And Yoav comes along, and he says to the soldiers standing there, why haven't you killed the guy? And they said, didn't you hear what David said? David said, don't hurt him. And Yoav says, don't hurt him. And Yoav has all these soldiers kill him. Because Yoav is a general, and he thinks like a general, not like a father. And he knows this guy just started a rebellion. There's no way I'm not going to kill him. There's no way I'm going to leave him to start another rebellion. And here's one of those touches that is so vivid and so powerful that people who don't read the Bible don't believe that things like this are in the Bible. This is what happens. So David, when he hears that Avshalom dies, is inconsolable. In a famous scene, he's walking up on the balcony and he says, Absalom, Absalom, if God had taken you instead of me, oh Absalom, Absalom, which is where Faulkner got his Satpen saga. If any of you have ever read it, it's a modernization of the David Avshalom story. What most people don't realize, if they don't read the story, is David is inconsolable and he's mourning for Avshalom, and Yoav, the general who just killed him, comes up to David and says, cut it out. David says, what do you mean cut it out? He says, all those soldiers out there just risked their lives so that you could be king, and they're listening to you cry for the person who was trying to kill them, and if you want an army tomorrow, you better stop crying right now. And David does, because he is, to borrow from Shakespeare again, every inch a king. And he goes out and he thanks his troops and he puts it away. Which raises one of the two questions, and with these I'll close, that galvanized me when I was going to write this book. What happened was, by the way, Steve Zipperstein, whom some of you may know, who's the editor of the Yale series, she took me out to lunch and he said, we're doing this series of Jewish lives, and we'd like you to write one of the lives. We thought maybe you would want to write a biblical one. You can write whatever you want. We thought maybe the Bible. Moses is taken. That was how he put it. Moses is taken. And in fact, Aviva Zornberg just came out with a beautiful book about Moses. So I said, that's okay. I'm going for David. And there were two questions that really intrigued me about this. One is, nowhere in the Bible does it say that David loved anyone. Again and again, we're told that other people love David. And he even says, Jonathan, your love was dearer to me than the love of women. That's what he says in his eulogy. But he doesn't say, my love for you. So the first thing I wondered is, does David love? I know that he is loved, but does he love? And the second question I wondered was, exactly what Rabbi Feinstein said at the beginning, which is, why are they singing David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam? I mean, this is a problematic guy. He has a lot of blood on his hands. You know, that's the explanation that's given for why he can't build the temple, why Solomon does. And in fact, at the end of his life, when he's dying, and Solomon is going to be the new king, and that's also a complicated succession story, but I'm going to leave that out for the moment. You would think, well, what David's last words are to him? You would think it would be some inspirational speech about Israel and God and so on and so forth. David says, listen, this guy who gave me a hard time, you make sure that he doesn't go peacefully to his grave, right? I promise you, Mario Puzo read David before he wrote The Godfather. It's just, I swear it, he's just like The Godfather. Because he also says the opposite. He goes, this other guy who helped me when I was running away from Avshalom, make sure you're good to him. It's exactly what he does. Now, the generous reading of this, because like a lot of biographers, I a little bit fell in love with my subject. The generous reading of this is that David knows it's very nice to give flatulent generalities about God and Israel and so on. But what Solomon really needs, because he's going to be a new king, is he needs to know who the enemies are. So if you're going to be a good father, you don't say, love the God of Israel, you say, kill that guy, right? Because that will be of inestimable use if that guy is the kind of person who's going to plot against Solomon too. But still, this is David. You want more. So, and in fact, by the way, the ambiguity of whether David loves or not is so deep that it goes down to the textual level, by which I mean the Septuagint, which is the early Greek translation of the Bible. It says that David loved his firstborn son, right? Not Avshalom, the one actually, the Amnon, the one who started the whole mess by raping his sister. I omitted that story, although I'm happy to tell it to you if you want to know. But it says it in the Septuagint to explain why David didn't take action against him. What happens basically is Amnon rapes his half-sister, not his sister, but his half-sister, who's a full sister to Avshalom. And that begins Avshalom's hatred of David, because David doesn't do anything against his half-brother who rapes his sister, okay? But in the Septuagint, if you didn't get that, don't worry about it. But in the Septuagint, all you have to do is read tomorrow's paper. You'll, I'm sure, read some version of that story. God knows. But in the Septuagint, it says that David didn't take any action against Amnon because he loved him. But in our text, it doesn't have that verse. So the question is, was it taken out or was it added? In other words, the ambiguity about whether David loved actually goes right down, drills down into the text. My own sense, and I don't know, obviously I don't know this, is it's too easy to just say, oh, David was a narcissist. Like every great leader, does he have narcissistic tendencies? Of course he does, because otherwise you don't think you can be king. I mean, who thinks they can be king? You've got to think well of yourself. But he has another side. And so it's not so easy to dismiss him. And that's why, in the end, I think David is the one that gets chosen by God. See, at the end of the book, it says that David was a man after God's own heart. And what does that mean? Well, we usually think of the Messiah as this person who is all goodness. But you know, if he's after God's own heart, we know that God created a world in which there's everything. And the traditional Jewish concept is, like it says in Isaiah, Oseh shalom uvarei ra. God creates peace and makes bad. Because if God makes everything, God makes the bad stuff too. Why? Different question. But if a human being is going to be the representative of God on earth, then he has to be everything. And David is as close to everything as a human being can be, certainly in the ancient world. He's a warrior and a son and a brother and a poet and a lover, and he's brutal and he's tender and he's a musician and he's a king and he flees and he builds a home and he hands on succession and everything that you could think of that a human being in the ancient world could do, David does. He is a more full human being than anyone, I would argue, in all of literature. There's no part of the human experience that David doesn't touch. And so maybe the reason that he gets to be the progenitor of the Messiah, because the Messiah is going to come from the house of David, in Jewish and Christian tradition, by the way, maybe the reason he is because he's the most fully human and forces us to confront the fact that we are all of those things and more. And in that sense, even though we don't know David's story as well as we know the story of Abraham or the story of Moses, David's story is much more our story. And to know him is to know more about ourselves. Thank you.
We have a lot of questions, a lot of David questions. So let's take 5. Get a cup of brownies tonight. Pretty good? Yeah? Would anyone like to sponsor them? I could use, if you give me a large donation, I'll name the brownies for you. Wouldn't that be the Goldfarb family brownies or something? And think of the nachas you'd get every time Jews ate the brownies.
As sweet as a Goldfarb.
There you go, right? The brownies are given in memory of Mr. and Mrs. Floorflusher. You know, I mean, something like, think of the things we could do with this. Anyway, thank you for being here. And once again, thank you to Rabbi Wolpe for coming and joining us.
It's my pleasure.
We could spend most of the night talking about 500 different things. There are so many things that we would love to spend time, and we never get a chance to see each other except occasions like this, right. About synagogue life, about the conservative movement, about relations with Israel. But tonight what I'd like to do is really restrict the conversation to the topic, which is Bible, and particularly the character of David, and more generally what David means in the Bible. So let me begin by asking you a few questions, and then then we'll get a few questions from the community here. What's the lesson for leaders? What is the Bible trying to tell us about leadership in the character of David? He is the most accomplished leader in the Bible. In many ways, way more accomplished than, say, Moses, for example, who leaves us with a very mixed legacy.
Right.
So what's the Bible trying to tell us about leadership?
I think what David does better than Moses, and that leaders, the best leaders do well, you should excuse me, is he's a combination of idealistic and ruthless. And you have to be. You have to be. And I mean, I think that's true of all leadership. I remember when I was trying out for Sinai, one past president said to me, I only have one question for you. I said, what? He said, how good are you at politics? And it sounds like a funny question, but the truth is that you have to be able to see like what the lay of the land is in any leadership position, and David could really do that. And I think that Moses couldn't. Moses was almost, in a weird way, too pure to be an effective leader, which is why he got into trouble. I don't think David would have had, although David had a terrible rebellion from his own son, but all kings, you know, Louis XIV said, I would rather be killed by my enemies than my children, right? Because all kings had rebellions from their kids. And David was, for a lot of reasons, was not a good father. But I think that that's the lesson for leadership is you can't be too pure. You have to be thoughtful, pragmatic, sometimes a little manipulative, and that's not wrong. William Stafford, who was a poet, gave the classic critique of people who are reformers. He said, if you purify the pond, the water lilies die. And there is something about that. You have to also understand the way the real world works. Mm-hmm.
So when you look at the story, let's go to the Bathsheba story, which you covered so wonderfully. Who wrote that story? Or in other words, from what point of view is that story told? It certainly wasn't a friend of David's who wrote that story.
That's what's so fascinating. That's a great question, because it's what's so fascinating about the whole story is it's clear that the reason that I believe a lot of this story, right? I am on record as being somewhat skeptical of some biblical stories, not to put too fine a point on it.
You're legendary.
By the way, just FYI, I just wrote a review for the New York Times Book Review of a book by Richard Elliott Friedman that defends the historical veracity of the Exodus. So I will leave that. We'll leave that for another time. But the reason that I believe that a lot of the David story is true is it's a story that makes him look bad, that ultimately favors him. Mm-hmm. That says that he's the king and his children to be the king and he should continue to be the king forever and ever, but he was an SOB, right? And so, and nobody, why would you make up a story like that if you were actually chronicling the king? So I think it had to be someone, most scholars think, that it was either through someone either in David's court or shortly after David died, and all these stories were current about him. And so I think it was probably, it was a writer of genius who knew he had a great story and wrote it with a deep knowledge of the incidents of David's life.
Well, let's go a little deeper with that.
Okay.
Would it be right to say what you have in the David story is a set of stories that somebody edited together?
Yeah.
Some of those stories are deeply favorable. I think the Goliath story, when I read the Goliath story, it reads to me like a pageant, like a
Yes.
cantata.
Right.
You can make a script out of it very easily, and I could see that on the king's birthday every year,
Right.
they perform the Goliath story because there's all these soliloquies, right?
Yep.
When he goes down into the
Right.
valley, there's this monster standing there, covered with metal from head to toe, who threatens to kill him, but he has time to make a soliloquy about, you come to me with spears, and I come to you in the name of God, and it's goofy. I mean,
It's true.
but that was clearly a pro-David guy. This one is deeply critical of him personally. I had a kid once, I was teaching this, and he said, Rabbi, he broke all 10 commandments in one shot. You know, he
Right.
had adultery and coveted
Well,
and killed and
yeah.
lied and dishonored God and broke his promise, and the whole thing happened on a Shabbos afternoon. You know?
It was Yom Kippur. too.
Yeah, Nachbasser, right.
So
Right.
the one Bible scholar that I actually had conversation with said that he thought that the reason that David became the exemplar is because the one sin he didn't commit was idolatry. Everyone else committed idolatry all the time. David didn't commit idolatry. So in other words, he always believed in God, even if, like most people who believe in God, he didn't always do what he knew God wanted him to do. But I'm not, the one thing that I don't know, and I'm sort of agnostic about, is this a collection from different hands put together? Or is this someone who, like a lot of people, saw the virtues and the faults in David and was resolved to write about both? It could be, you know?
So when you think about that author,
Yeah.
I mean, I thought it in your book and tonight in the talk, this remarkable insight that David, the beloved,
Yeah.
doesn't love, or he's not shown to love. He has desire.
Right.
I mean, you know, he certainly has desires and he has impulses, but that it's not a reciprocal kind of love. So the question I was wondering is like, well, why would you tell that story? Why wouldn't you
Unless
make him,
it's the story. Unless it's actually the story.
yeah.
I mean, the one time when he seems clearly to love is when he's devastated about the loss of his child. But again, that's a different kind of love.
I don't know if he's devastated loss. I read that as guilt. He got busted.
Okay.
You know.
All right, but he could be devastated by guilt. Whether it's the loss that devastates him or the guilt is a question.
Yeah.
But maybe that was the story.
Because he's awfully quick to get up from mourning once the kid is dead.
No, I'm talking about Avshalom.
Avshalom.
I'm talking about Avshalom. He's devastated by Avshalom, but also guilt because he was responsible to some extent for Avshalom's rebellion. I don't know. It's hard to know because it's, as I said, my instinct about people is I don't even know myself, right? I surprise myself. There are all sorts of things I never thought I would do, and then I end up doing them, like being a rabbi of a synagogue. And so for me to say that I know someone else is already a huge leap of faith. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if David in fact loved, but I know that that the text at least hints at the fact that he had a lot of trouble with it.
So when you read the text again, and you read it so beautifully, so sensitively, why does God love him? Why doesn't God hold out for somebody better?
Well, I mean, the answer that I gave in the talk was that he's everything. But the answer that I would give is, to you, is that this is how God actually acts in the Bible. God falls in love. He falls in love with Abraham. He falls in love with Jacob. Isaac, not so much, it seems, but he falls in love with, seriously, he falls in love with Jacob. God falls in love arbitrarily. You don't fall in love with the person who meets all the qualities that you're looking for. You fall in love with the person you fall in love with. And sometimes we fall in love with people that we know aren't deserving of our love, but we love them. And go figure, and it doesn't matter. And you say to yourself, I should love this person. But so I almost want to say that if there isn't an arbitrary quality to your love, it's not real love. If it's actually built on the person who most deserves it, I'm more suspicious of it than if you say to me, look, I just love him. What can I say? And I think that in the Torah, that's sort of like what God is like. God he falls in love with Abraham. And the way that I read it is that you have to prove God's love subsequently. That is, I fall in love with Abraham. I fall in love with Moses. They haven't done that much yet. Now prove to me that you're worthy of my love. And I guess on balance, David does, although he's a very problematic child.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's, in that story, one more question about that story, because that story fascinates me. Nathan, the character of Nathan. Now, first of all, why not just keep your mouth shut?
Yeah.
Uriah dies in battle, a hero.
Right.
David takes the grieving widow into his home. And ladies and gentlemen, what sort of man is our good king? The Lord God blessed that man, and she gives birth to a beautiful baby boy in only 7 months. And you know what? They name him for Uriah.
Yeah.
And it's like, as the great Rabbi Oliver Hardy once said, nobody is the wiser.
Right.
Everyone sees this as it's the most beautiful piece of political propaganda. And then shows up this guy, Nathan, and pops the balloon,
Yes.
putting his life in danger.
Yep. So I have two theories. Because such a good question doesn't deserve just one theory.
Please.
One theory, which I believe, in something like this, when you think you've come up with an original thing and you say it, then everybody tells you how in 1872, in some German...
Rashi, no,
right,
Rashi,
exactly,
Rashi.
Rashi, always Rashi. But here's something that I proposed very tentatively in the book that I've actually never heard anyone else say, which is Jerusalem's a very small city. At the end of David's life, Nathan and Bathsheba conspire together to get Solomon named as the next king over Adoniah, okay? So I think maybe he knew Bathsheba. Maybe he knew her family. It's not so strange to think, how did Nathan know that this had happened? Of course, traditionally, he's a prophet, so he knows, but maybe he knew because he actually knew the family. Maybe Bathsheba's father came to him and said, Nathan, you got to go to the king and make this right. I don't know. So that's theory number one, okay? Theory number two, which is not necessarily in contradiction to theory number one, is how there are some people who on one level you admire them, although you don't want to have anything to do with them, who are just moral scolds, and they can't be normal, in quotes, the way we are. That is, they can't see something wrong and just ignore it. They always make a fuss. And the reason that this is particularly poignant now, honestly, is the sexual harassment scandal. So in many different, as you know and I know, in many different sexual harassment situations, a lot of people knew what was going on. A lot of people, right? And I'm not talking about the worst of the worst. I'm not talking about Weinstein, who seems like a moral monster. I'm talking about people who are just jerks, and in bad ways jerks. And everyone around them sees it. But they all know that life is so much easier if you just don't say anything and it goes away. But there are some people who can't do that. And they are pains in the neck. But that's what prophets were like. You don't want a prophet as your next door neighbor. Because he's the person who's always going to say, it's a desert, you're watering your lawn? Why are you watering your lawn in a desert? And the thing is, you know that he's right, and so your answer is, you're a jerk, right? That's your answer. You're a jerk. And he is a jerk, but he's a jerk because he can't play by the normal social rules. So that's how I think of prophets. They can't do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like the other answer that you gave before, which was that you have here two competing theories of kingship. You have the prevailing Mesopotamian theory, which is the king is the law.
Right.
You know, what Louis XIV said, I'm the state,
Right.
I'm France. The king does what he wants. And you have the prophet who shows up with a radical new idea. The king is under God's sovereignty.
Yeah.
The king is subject to standards of justice, which ultimately is the Bible's idea, because Abraham raises the same question to God. Shofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. The judge of all the earth has to do justice. And you have a political conversation here between two competing theories, and the one that wins is the more radical one.
So I'd like to just present, you can either have Rabbi Feinstein's theory that the prophet is a representative of a new political theory, or you can have mine that he's a jerk. Those are the two, and it's really either one would serve. It just depends. You know, maybe it's because I spend more of my time in the city.
No.
That I go right for the jerk theory. No, but I mean, I think that's a beautiful way of thinking about it, is that what he's enunciating is exactly the whole metaphysic of the Jewish tradition, which is that no human being,
Right.
king or not. In fact, there's a beautiful halacha, which I don't know if you're aware of, that you bow at the beginning and the end of the first blessing of the Amidah and the last blessing of the Amidah. So the Talmud says if you're a high priest, you bow at the beginning and the end of every blessing. And if you're the king, you say the entire Amidah bowed. Because you really need to remind yourself that you're not the king. You're not the king. You're the king, but you're not the king. I remember once I did a dialogue with Avram Burg in Israel, and someone asked him, why do you wear a kippah? And he said, because I like to remember where I end. You know? It was a very good answer.
That's a very good thing.
Yeah, it was a very good answer.
So Steve Zipperstein is a lovely guy.
he is.
He's a professor of history at Stanford, and he's the editor of this wonderful series called Jewish Lives. He came to you and said, choose another biblical, Aviva has Moshe, choose somebody else. And you chose David. Who would have been your second choice?
Well, my second choice clearly would have been someone that was already taken by Yair Zakovich, and that's Jacob.
Okay,
would
why?
have been my second choice. Because Jacob changes. He's not a steady state character.
Yeah.
There's fascinating development with Jacob, and also because, honestly, it would have given me a chance I wrote it in one of my books, but it would have given me a chance again to use an extraordinarily beautiful teaching from my father that should be better known.
Go ahead.
So the question is,
Rabbi Walpe's father, Rabbi Gerald Walpe of blessed memory, was one of the great rabbis and teachers
and this is
of a generation.
Thank you.
And somebody who, if you live in Philadelphia, he's a superstar. If you live out of Philadelphia, you have to find out who he is. And when you find out who he is, then he becomes somebody that rabbis
I will tell you
admire.
something about my father that you will appreciate. When I first moved to Los Angeles and I didn't know who Rabbi Schulweis was, and I heard all about Rabbi Schulweis, I called my father and I said, do you know Harold Schulweis? And he said, yeah, we were students together. I said, who is he? He said, he's the most talented man in the American rabbinate. That was his answer.
Yeah, right. So what did your father
So my father said about Jacob, Jacob and Esau, Jacob steals Esau's birthright. Esau's going to kill him. He runs away. To make a long story short, when Esau sees him, instead of killing him, Esau comes to see him with 400 men. He's obviously intent on doing him harm. Instead of killing him, he falls on his neck and weeps. Why? Why? Why doesn't he kill him? So my father said, remember that Jacob and Esau were twins. They weren't identical twins, but they were twins. He said, the difference between our world and the ancient world is in the ancient world, you never saw yourself. There were no mirrors. In the modern world, we see ourselves 100 times a day, right? More. But in the ancient world, remember, Narcissus falls in love with himself when he looks in a pool. Have you ever tried to see yourself in the water? It's a very imperfect reflection of who you are. He says, so think of Jacob and Esau who have not seen themselves in decades. And then they see a sort of imperfect reflection of themselves, and they see how old they have each grown in hatred and bitterness. And when they see themselves, instead of fighting, they weep. So I would love to have been able to put that in more homes, that teaching. But For that and other reasons, I think Jacob is just an amazing story. So that would have been my second choice.
So when I want to expand the conversation for a moment about how you read Bible, okay? Your comment about the Exodus has become rather notorious.
Famous, not
It depends on whose Seder table you're sitting at. There's even this rabbi in L.A. that said,
Yeah.
I know him. He's a friend of mine. Shut up,
I know.
Tell me a bit about how you read the Torah. I mean, you like me. You every single week you're teaching it all the time. You're teaching it, but in the quieter moments of David Wolpe's life, when you open Tanakh, you open the Torah, and you read there. What do you find? What do you read? How do you read it?
I read, as you probably can tell, I don't know why, but I read psychologically. I read for the characters and how they interact and what they mean, which is why when I'm confronted with the historical difference between the Torah and the world, it doesn't bother me. So I say, okay, so historically, but the characters. And what amazes me, as it amazes, I think, everybody who studies the Torah, is that there's never a time that I read it that I don't find something that I didn't find before. And it really is inexhaustible. Like, again, let me give you a Jacob example. I read the Torah, this story 1,000 times, Jacob and the angel. So I'm reading Jacob and the angel in Shul, which is where, by the way, I often think of my sermons, because it's the one place where I have no distractions. You can get bored in Shul, and I'm very much in favor of boredom, by the way. I think boredom is a great thing, because when you're bored is when your mind goes to places that it's free to go to, and you're not directed by. So people should come to Shul if only to be bored. But
I can recommend a lot of
right,
shuls,
a lot of
too, by the
shuls,
way.
right, exactly. Not during Rabbi Feinstein's sermon, but other times. So I was reading it in Shul, and remember what happens. Jacob grabs the angel. The angel says, the sun is coming up. I need to leave. Jacob says, I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me. He says, what's your name? He says, Jacob. He says, your name is no longer Jacob. Now your name is Israel. Okay? I read that 1 billion times until it all of a sudden struck me. People come to me for blessings all the time. All the time. If someone comes, and what do they come for? Children, health, success. If I said to someone, your name is no longer Eddie, now it's Fred, you would say, what kind of blessing is this? Really? And what does the angel say to him? I changed your name. Thank you very much. I wanted a blessing. But of course, the answer is that he's giving him the blessing of self-transformation. Yeah. But that's how I read it. I read it to say, what haven't I seen before that, and honestly, I think I read it the way rabbis read it. This is not necessarily good. I read it also, what can I say about this? Because the way I work and this has always been true, is I'm very non-introspective. I don't know what I think until I see what I say. That's quoting E.M. Forster said that, actually. So for me, in order to know what I believe about the text, I actually have to talk about it, because I know how some people can just sit there and think about their lives, and I can't do that. I sit there for 2 seconds, then I open a book. And I'm not, it's like some sort of weird rabbinic ADD stuff. I don't know what it is. But so I read the Torah to think, what would I say about this? How could I explain that? That's how I read it.
Yeah.
So.
No, but I don't think that's bad. I think that's how.
Yeah.
Rabbi Schulweis used to say that homiletics is the best form of psychotherapy.
Yeah.
Which means
Perfect.
that you all have to hear our neuroses
Right.
week after
Yes.
week after week.
That's right. And
Week
it's there's no doubt about that.
Week after week.
Yeah.
So, is there a scene in the Bible that's the one for you? That's your favorite. That's that one that grasps you every time you read it, that you return to time and again. Is there one scene that defines you in some sense? David Hartman used to ask us: is there a text that's your text that defines you?
So, I would. There are interpreters who are my interpreters that define me. So like the Kotzker Rebbe, whom I adore, even though he was crazy, or maybe because he was crazy. But I would say that for me, the most inexhaustible single text, the one that I've taught most often, and it's not at all original, is the Adam and Eve story, because I think that it's all about death and the reality of death and coming to terms with death. And ever since, as a high school student, I read Ernest Becker's Denial of Death, which for me was the most influential book I ever read. I have been unable to read the Adam and Eve story, and in fact the whole Torah, without understanding it as a way to come to terms with mortality.
Wow.
So,
Really?
yeah.
You read as a high school kid?
My father, it was the only book my father ever told me to read.
Seriously?
He said, you got to read this book. So I did.
Wow.
And I've read it since 3, 4 times. There are a few books that I've read many times. Middlemarch, the novel, Denial of Death, and 2 other novels, but that I've read over and over again.
Ernest Becker was a great social scientist who himself died very young.
Yes.
And wrote a book which unfortunately was the butt of a joke in Annie Hall.
That's true.
In
Yeah.
Woody Allen's movie. It's called The Denial of Death. And it happens to be one of the truly brilliant.
It really is brilliant.
His basic thesis is that all of human culture is a way of dealing with the fact that human beings are unique and precious, but we die, and we know we're going to die. And so how do you make sense of a life that you know is limited, fallible, and fragile, right?
Perfect.
And that
Beautifully put.
And it's a remarkable.
Yeah.
It is a remarkable. So
So-
let me pursue that. Just for I
Sure.
didn't mean it, but as long as you. How did your father read Torah?
I think probably much the same. I think I learned it from him.
Yeah.
I think much the same way.
Did you learn together?
No, but I never sat down and studied with my father, but I had the best substitute, which was the dinner table. So our dinner table was the best classroom I've ever been in, because my father was a storyteller, and he told a billion stories, and many of the stories that I tell came from him. And so but he studied like I studied. I think that he was, in this also, he was like me. That is, he was basically asocial. He studied by himself. He didn't have a chevruta. But it wasn't that he didn't like people. He liked, as I do, but he spent a lot of time alone. And that was nourishing for him. He was an only child, so I think that he came by it naturally. And when I tell people I'm asocial and they say, no, you're not, you seem so social and so on, I say, anybody who has read as many books in his life as I have had to spend a lot of time alone, right? You can't actually do that with other people. So I think I got that from him, and I think he read Torah to nourish himself and to be able to speak about it, and I sort of imbibed that without even being aware of it.
So I wouldn't say that you're asocial. I would say that the characters you meet in books are your chevra.
Yes, I think that's true.
You know, David is
Right.
your. I mean, the way you write about David
Yes.
is much more intimate than
Right.
any commentary. That's why I love the book so
He
much.
feels very, yes.
He's your chevra.
He feels very, I mean, let me put it
He's
this
very
way.
different than you
I
are.
have a daughter, she's 20 years old, okay? I mean, we talk about many, many, many things, but I would say our most common interaction is she will write me and say, I just listened to this Jane Austen novel, and this is what it should really be called, right? And when she does stuff like that, what I hear is, my father's still around. He's still there. He's speaking through his granddaughter, even though he's been dead for 7 years. Because that's, yes, the characters in books. My daughter says the greatest blessing of her life is that she grew up in real time with Harry Potter, right? So that's someone who lives in books, and I think that that's just somehow you're born, you learn it, but you're born with it. So, yeah.
Yeah, she once paid me a great compliment, your daughter. I gave
Good.
her my book for her bat mitzvah,
Yeah.
and she said, I still don't believe in God, but I really like your book. So
I got to tell you,
I was gonna put that
is
on the
about,
cover.
honest to God, that's about as
I was
good as
going to
it
put that
gets.
on the cover. You know,
That is
So
about as
Merle
good as it
Wolpe,
gets. Right, exactly.
daughter of the
Yeah.
famous Rabbi Wolpe,
Exactly.
says, I don't believe in
Yeah.
God, but I like this
Yeah.
book. We have just a few minutes. I'd like to ask you to do the following. I know that it's greatly tempting for me, too, to ask Rabbi Wolpe a million questions about a million different things, but let's stick to the topic of Bible and the characters of the Bible, and we'll let Louise choose who's going to ask the next question, please.
Rabbi Wolpe,
Yeah.
I would like to thank you for this most illuminating and fascinating.
Is the
Thank you.
microphone on? Is it on?
I'll be happy to repeat it. She said she really enjoyed it. It was good.
Speaking into it because it's on. Okay, it is on. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
That's better. Here you go.
All right. So, you've talked a great deal about the figures, some of the figures in the Bible that you find so fascinating. I'd like to know about any of the women figures in the Bible that you feel are particularly fascinating.
Okay,
And-
so, yeah, I'm sorry. So let me just, the women figures in the Bible, let me just tell you, I write a weekly column, actually now for 25 years, for the New York Jewish Week. I'm going on sabbatical January to June, and I just said to the editor, listen, I've been writing this for 25 years, I'm going on sabbatical for 6 months, and he said, that's good, because every 25 years we give our columnists 6 months off. So, but the one that I wrote today, that came out today, we send it out electronically, it's called Off the Pulpit, was all about the fact that actually in the denial of death, he quotes Tolstoy as saying, from a child of 5 to me is a small step. From 0 to a child of 5 is an enormous distance. And for most of Jewish history, and for most of history, human history, the person who influenced the child from 0 to 5 was the mother. Right? The father didn't take over the education. In Judaism, actually, until they were 6, which according to Tolstoy and modern theory, when they were fully formed, then the father took them over. And I said there's a beautiful Torah example of that. After Sarah dies, Abraham has 6 more children. Right? At the end of Chayei Sarah, he marries a woman named Keturah, who the tradition identifies with Hagar, it doesn't matter. He has 6 more children. None of them follow Abraham. None of them are monotheists. None of them are Jews. So who's the decisive figure? It's obviously Sarah, right? It's not Abraham. And I think that that's the Torah's way of saying that the person who really matters here in the continuity of Judaism is Sarah. And I always found that a very powerful statement. And I think in some ways of all the women in the Torah, I find several of the women, I find Bathsheba fascinating too. But I think that Sarah is the one that sort of holds the most weight because she's the one that's responsible for the continuity of our tradition. It isn't Abraham, clearly, because he has all these other kids, including Ishmael, and they don't end up being his progeny. So, not intellectually or spiritually.
Who has the mic? Mark?
As you said, David was a man after God's own heart. Would you say the same today? Is the God of today different than the God of David's time?
So there are 2 ways of thinking about God: our perception of God or the reality of God. And since this is an enormous subject, I will evade the subject by saying this. I sometimes say to the high schoolers, think of a 2-year-old. You're 14, you're 15. Does a 2-year-old understand what it is to be a 15-year-old? Obviously not. Not only does a 2-year-old not understand it, but a 2-year-old doesn't even know what it is they don't understand about being a 15-year-old. Now, in the Jewish tradition, whatever God is, the distance between God and human beings is greater than that between a 15-year-old and a 2-year-old. So for me to start defining what God was and is tremendous intellectual hubris. What I would say is David probably thought of God differently than the way we do. But as for the reality of God and what God was and is, I couldn't possibly pronounce.
Who has the mic? Douglas?
I do. I was struck by your comment that you said David listened to women. And I was kind of confused about his relationship with Michal, because if I remember, there was a big rebuke that she gave him that kind of put her in the dumps, and
Yeah.
he never had to deal with her again.
Yes. Well, he listened to her, but doesn't mean he agreed with her. She got very upset because of his dancing, presumably naked in front of the Torah, or naked-ish in front of the Torah, and it says that she was shut up and never had a child again. So yeah, they had a huge falling out. I didn't say that David never had didn't have problematic relationships with women. And I think also, Michal, remember, David usurped Michal's father. So I think that was a relationship that was never really going to be very successful. But yeah, that is one of the saddest moments and most brutal moments in some ways of the whole David story, is Michal remarries, and David forces her to give up her husband, Paltiel, And what it says is he walked away weeping, which is sad for Michal and sad for Paltiel. I want to address one question. I don't know if you were going to, about the reality of David. Is that what you were going to ask?
Yeah, essentially.
Right. So
Should I ask it?
sure.
Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, there's no evidence that I know of outside of the Bible. So whether they're historical or not, we don't know. They're most likely mythical figures, which in a sense, as an aside, probably ruins any claim that Islam has to being an Abrahamic faith, but that's another story. But is there evidence of David outside of the Bible? And if there is that evidence the same, or the story the same as what's in the Bible?
So there is evidence, there is extra biblical evidence of David. One in particular, there's an inscription that was found pretty recently that says Beit David, House of David, from 200 years after David, from a non-Israelite source. But we don't know there's no confirmation of anything of the story. There couldn't be, really, in the Bible. And there's a lot of debate about what kind of kingdom David had. Was it a very small provincial kingdom, not this vast kingdom that the Bible makes it seem like it is? And there's also a lot of debate about whether what they call Ir David, the city of David. Let me just tell you, most archaeologists will not say you're walking through David's city, although some will. Inat Mazar particularly says that she's found David's city, but it's got a long way to go before she convinces the skeptics. So it's almost certain, I would say certain, that there was a David, but more than that's very hard to say. So.
Right. Let me just fill in the details, because actually it's quite a fascinating, just quick story.
Please.
So if you've ever been to Jerusalem, okay, and if you know where the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem is, and you know where the Dung Gate is, which is the entrance into the little town just past the Dung Gate, a little Arab town there, sits on a hill called Shilam. And that town is a tell. That's an archaeological tell. It's not really a hill. What it really is, it's sitting on 50 layers of archaeological remains. So Israeli archaeologists, very controversial because they had to displace a lot of Arab families, have started to excavate David's town, what was called David's city, Ir David. And they got to a certain level, and they discovered a massive palace. Huge palace. Huge walls, huge fortifications, water wells, water aqueducts. The archaeologist who is digging it up is Mazer, right? It's the daughter of the guy that did the tunnels. And she says this was King David's palace. Right? And then every other archaeologist in the world says, no, it's 1,000 years after King David's palace. Right? It's a big debate about what it is. Now imagine that. You've even found the thing and you can touch it,
right,
but you're not sure what it is because the carbon dating isn't that exact. Please, go ahead.
No, it's exactly right. I was just going to say that there was a long article in Haaretz in the past week or two.
Yeah.
That if you want to get the lay of the land about archaeology in the Bible, you can read it.
Yeah, Silwan, that's the name of the town. In Haaretz, go to Haaretz and type into the search bar. Haaretz is the Israeli newspaper. It's in English. Put in biblical archaeology. There's a wonderful summary of the current state of biblical archaeology, and the David inscriptions are there, and the whole controversy about this archaeological find.
And this, by the way, just not to cause trouble, but the whole Exodus question, most people don't understand that the question of whether there was an Exodus doesn't depend on whether you find stuff in the sand of the desert. They say, so you didn't find something in the sand of the desert. Doesn't mean people weren't there. Of course it doesn't mean people weren't there. The question of the Exodus has to do with settlement patterns in Israel. That is, if there was an exodus of hundreds of thousands of people, forget about the fact that they would stretch from one end of the desert to the other. Forget about that. What you would find is a huge influx, a change in pottery, building, and so on and so forth in Israel itself. And now that we actually can excavate in Israel, we know that's not true. It didn't happen. So whatever the exodus was, whatever population left Egypt, it wasn't the way the Bible describes it. And that's the That's the force of the claim. It's not about whether you find stuff in the desert, although with that many people you would find something, but still.
Who has the mic? Please.
Rabbi,
Farzan.
my question is about the book of Tehillim. When did David, if he wrote it, and
That's a
then
great
how
question.
has it found its place in prayer liturgy?
So Psalms, most scholars think that if David wrote any Psalms, they're very few. And in fact, when it says Mizmor LeDavid, it doesn't necessarily mean a psalm by David. It could mean to David, in the style of David, reminiscent of David, about David, because when you look at the Psalms that are embedded in the text, like when you look at Hannah's Psalm in the book of Hannah and in the book of Samuel, or David's Psalm at the end of the book of 2 Samuel, they don't fit the story very well. So it seems like they were independent compositions that were then put in there. By the way, this is also true of the Song of the Sea, Shirat Hayam, right? It talks about Canaanite tribes who are seized with trembling. Why were they seized with trembling if the Israelites are leaving Egypt? The Canaanites didn't hear anything about that, right? That also seems to have been composed later. So there's a lot. However, having said that, I think that the reason that Psalms found their way so powerfully, whether David ever wrote any of them, we can't know. The reason they found their way so powerfully into Jewish worship is they're the only individual prayers in the whole corpus of the Torah. There aren't any other individual. I mean, there's one or two that are very short, like when Moses prays for Miriam. But here's an entire book that is in, first of all, it's in the first person. Most Jewish prayers are in the collective. And they express universal themes. So they were probably, most of them were probably written as liturgical compositions for the temple or for other things, but they touch people's hearts. So they made their way into the prayer book.
Good. Who has the mic?
I do. Rabbi,
Where are you?
over here.
Oh, stand
Stand up,
up,
please.
For God's sakes.
Rabbi, in reading your book, you wrote that Carl Jung, you quote Carl Jung and John Adams about the unlived lives of children and how they follow their parents. And I was struck by Solomon building the temple, but then the kingdom split up, and it seems somewhat tragic. And I was wondering if you could just speak about Solomon's success and his failure.
So Solomon, there is, by the way, a good book in the Jewish Lives series by Stephen Weitzman about Solomon. Solomon was just more born to the kingship than David, and it seems as though Solomon was a successful, what's the right way to put it? Economically, empire building, at least in the book, the way it's portrayed, he's successful, but what he doesn't do, as a lot of leaders don't do, is provide for his succession, which is the most important thing to do. He doesn't do what David did, which was to make sure that this person is in place and crowned and is going to be king after I'm gone. And this leads me, although it's a little bit off topic, to tell you a beautiful drash that I include in the book. It's obviously not mine, it's rabbinic, about David. So at the very end of the book of Samuel, at the very beginning of the book of Kings, which is when David dies in the first 2 chapters of the book of Kings, the first chapter says, Melech David Zakein ba bayamim. King David is old, advanced in years. The second chapter begins, Vayikrevu Yemei David Lamut. David was dying. Now notice the difference in those two. King David is old. David is dying. Because when you face your own death, you don't face it as a king, right? You face it just as David. And what he was able to do that Solomon wasn't was to remember that there would be a world after him. And so he made sure that Solomon was provided for, but Solomon didn't do that with his kids as well. And so ultimately, in some way, you have to think of him as a failure for all of his successes, because it was only under David and Solomon that the kingdom was united. Then it was broken apart, and the north was conquered in 722 by the Assyrians, and the 10 tribes scattered, and they were lost to history until Utah.
And on that note, I'd like to thank Rabbi Wolpe for joining us tonight. Next week, we are off. Have a lovely Thanksgiving. We return November 27th to take up the rabbis and the creation of the Talmudic tradition. Thanks for being here tonight. Meet you in Athens.